Well, I'm Let's give everybody 90 more seconds. We'll actually might start on time today.
Oh, should I just do it from up there?
You can do it from there if it works.
Yeah, if it works.
Good morning, everybody. We'd rather be in a really big room with you, but as you can see, and please don't get disconcerted, I hope you're not eating breakfast. It's a small room, and we're by ourselves, although that's 3 times as many people as I'm used to in this room. So I don't know, there's other people in here. And I've acquired a lot of bad habits, I suppose, in the past 2 semesters, wandering around in front of this camera in this room. But I'm Chris Paine. And I'm the full-time history faculty here at Lake Michigan College. And my 2 colleagues, Tim Moore and Kristen Robinson, and I got this bright idea that we should all talk to you about pandemics of the past. So we prepared what I believe are 3 very interesting presentations of about 15 to 20 minutes. And our plan after all 3 of us have gone, and it will be Tim and Kristen and yours truly, is to throw it open for some Q&A or discussion, whether that means you would like to talk to us, or if you don't have a microphone, we have a nice chat feature in Zoom. And one of us, I suppose, will actually be manning the chat box. So we can maybe, if you cannot say your question, or you have something that you don't have the capability of doing that, you can ask us in writing and we can answer you that way. So we hope to start that around 11 and go to if everybody wants to, 11:30, maybe as late as 11:45. I have a class in this room at noon, so we can't go on all day because maybe we'd like to. Anyway, I'd like to thank not just my colleagues, Tim and Kristen, for doing this, but I'd also like to thank, oh, I'm getting an echo and I don't know why. That's okay. You'll find that I know a lot about the 19th century. I don't know a lot about the 21st. I'd also like to thank the Arts and Sciences Division. I'd like to thank the LMC marketing folks for getting the word out there. Many of you have gotten the word from them. You sure as heck didn't get it directly from me, I suppose. And I hope this is such a great success that we call it the first annual, because next year we're hoping to be in an actual large room on campus with an actual crowd of people in front of us, although there might be an online component, not necessarily excluding you who live far away, and doing this again on a different topic, because hopefully by next year, all of us will have forgotten this pandemic. Anyway. First up is Tim Moore, and he'll be talking about the flu epidemic pandemic of 1918. Yes.
Let me know if I start too much too long.
Okay.
Holler.
Oh, you're going to sit there?
Yeah.
Okay. He's coming, and I don't use a chair. He's going to.
Well,
that's okay.
I may not.
Sit down if I can sit still.
Can everyone hear me? I hope you're well. Thanks for joining us.
We can hear you, but we can barely see you, Tim.
Oh, you don't need to see me, do you? All right, goodness gracious.
You share the screen, you don't need to see.
Yeah, help me out. So,
Is that better? I don't have a screen so I can see.
okay.
Yep, that's good.
Is that good?
That's good.
The flu pandemic began in about March 1918 and lasted for about 15 months. It lasted into the summer of 1919. And it left more people dead in 15 months than the bubonic plague did in 100 years and more than AIDS has done in 40 years.
Oh, we're not seeing the.
Okay, my fault, my fault. Okay. Everyone out there can see the screen?
Well, if you've got a screen share, no, I'm just seeing the people.
Are they seeing the screen?
I don't know.
No, they're not.
Now.
Yeah, but you're not sharing your screen, Ken.
Okay.
Wait, are you? No, you're not.
No, we don't see it.
Oh, now it's over
It's
here.
kind of scary that in this crowd.
Yeah.
I'm tech support.
Okay.
Oh, it's going to show up there. Can't see that. I better mute myself.
It was, but now I don't know why it's on this one. Hang on. Here, let's try it this way. Here, sorry.
That's all right.
That's
There we go.
Oh, bless your heart. Thank you. So if I go into slideshow, we'll go. Can you still see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think you went into slideshow, did you?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Can you see that one?
Deadly second wave, fall 1918.
It's my fault because I don't use PowerPoint, and so I'm bad at this, but I'm sharing the wrong screen. It's going to pop up the wrong one. Let's try this. Just start it. It'll share the links. Sorry.
That's all right.
I share. I don't
Now we're seeing the Zoom screen.
Yeah, good, good. He's going to start a slideshow and you'll see the slideshow. That's exactly it.
Okay. There we go.
There we go.
Success?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. The world's population in 1918 was roughly 1.8 billion people, and it's estimated that at least 500 million of these people got sick with the flu. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention puts the number of dead worldwide at 50 million. Now, I've seen figures as low as 17 million and as high as 100 million. I'm just going to go with the CDC's 50 million. Of the 50 million, 675,000 were Americans. Now, the standard figure for the number of American soldiers who died in the Civil War is 620,000. So we lost more people in 15 months to the flu, 675,000, than we did in 4 years of Civil War. World War I and World War II, we lost about 530,000 or so people. So we lost more people to the flu than to both world wars combined. This flu hit hardest the healthiest young adults who are in their 20s and 30s, and it has something to do with their immune systems that produced excessive inflammation and too much fluid in the lungs that led to pneumonia. This was a worldwide pandemic. 27% of the residents of Frankfurt were hospitalized. 33% of the people in Japan got the flu. And these are the things that didn't exist. Scientists and physicians were behind the 8 ball from the beginning. There were no vaccines, there were no antiviral drugs, there were no antibiotics to fight pneumonia. The mechanical ventilators would not exist until the late 1920s. And the rest of the 20th century would be needed to identify the type of virus that produced this deadly flu. Even to this day, we call the flu of 1918 the Spanish flu, and that's a misnomer. We know the flu did not begin in Spain. The World War I powers censored the news, and Spain was technically neutral. So its reporters could publish news about sick World War I soldiers. And the Spanish king, Alfonso XIII, got badly sick with the flu, but survived. What kind of flu virus was this? I mean, the scientists and doctors didn't know it in 1918, but the CDC says this was an H1N1 virus, swine flu, that originated in birds. We still don't know to this day where this flu began. Some researchers have concluded that it began in China. During World War I, Britain transported Chinese workers to labor in war-related industries, and those Chinese workers may have spread the flu to soldiers. John Barry, who wrote a book called The Great Influenza, says the flu began in Haskell County, Kansas. Farmers in Haskell County raised hogs, which may have gotten the virus from birds. He writes that there were at least 17 different types of birds that flew through Haskell County, and the birds may have transmitted the virus to hogs. People throughout the United States often call the flu the La Grippe or the grip. These soldiers, these men in Haskell County, got drafted or volunteered and went to an army camp in Camp Funston at Fort Riley, Kansas. And they transmitted the flu. And on March 4th, the first reported cases at Camp Funston appeared. And then 2 weeks later, 1,100 soldiers were in the hospital. And other soldiers just were in the barracks, 38 of them died. Then it looked as if this flu was going to end. By July 1918, it seemed to be petering out. And the Army said the epidemic is about at an end and has been a benign type. John Barry writes, this first wave of flu was like a tsunami that pushes water away from the shore before it crashes into the shore and destroys everything in its path. The second wave began in August 1918, and 24 of the 36 Army camps had outbreaks. And of course, many of these soldiers were put on transport ships and then shipped to Europe, where the flu spread further. John Barry writes, the second wave of influenza was everywhere, from icebound Alaska to steaming Africa, and this time it was lethal. And of the 3 or 4 waves, the second wave by far was the deadliest. And as the flu spread, of course, communities shut down the schools, theaters, banned public gatherings, shut down churches. But at the same time, our Army needed soldiers. And so you have thousands and thousands of American men going into induction centers and then into military camps, and then from there on transport ships. And they gave the flu to those who were next to them. Shirley Fannin is an epidemiologist, and she says one person coughing in a room filled with other people would spew millions of particles with disease-causing organisms into the air. It doesn't take very long for one flu case to become 10,000 cases. Even when Germany was on the verge of collapse in October 1918, President Wilson rejected a request to halt transport ships. And the Army Chief of Staff, who was Peyton March, said, Mr. President, any soldier who dies of the flu aboard a transport ship is just as much a hero as those who die in the trenches. Some of the soldiers went to Camp Devens, which is just 35 miles outside of Boston. This camp was overcrowded. And in one day, 1,500 soldiers got sick with the flu. The hospital was filled up. It refused to take any more patients, and soldiers either survived or died right in the barracks. The cafeteria, there weren't enough cafeteria workers. They got the flu to feed the soldiers who were still well enough to eat. Roy Grist was a doctor at Camp Devens, and he wrote a letter about what he and the nurses and the doctors saw. This letter was written to a fellow physician. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots on the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you begin to see the cyanosis extending from the ears and spreading all over the face, until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. One can stand to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but to see these poor devils dropping like flies sort of gets on your nerves. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day and still keeping up. There is no doubt in my mind that there is a new mixed infection here, but what, I don't know. Special trains were needed just to haul away the dead soldiers and the nurses and the doctors. There weren't enough coffins. A large barrack was set up for the dead soldiers, long lines of dead soldiers all dressed up and laid out in double rows, Dr. Grist wrote. It beats any sign they ever had in France after a battle. And like the nurses and doctors of 2020 and 2021, these doctors and nurses worked, 14, 15, 16-hour days. Some of the soldiers from Camp Devens went to Philadelphia and they spread the flu. The head of the health department in Philly was Wilmer Kristen, and he made it very clear that his health department would confine this disease. There was no concern whatsoever. One day after he made that statement, 2 sailors were dead. And he told Philadelphians that from now on, the disease will decrease. The very next day, 14 sailors and 1 civilian died. And Philadelphia will lose at least 12,000 people to the flu, and most of them died in October and November 1918. Philly had a big Liberty Loan parade scheduled for September 8th. One way we financed our participation in World War I was through war bonds. We called them Liberty Loans. And cities had quotas. They wanted to meet their Liberty Loan quota. Doctors told Dr. Kristen to cancel the parade. This was going to be a super spreader event, and he refused. He said, we can't cancel. We won't meet our Liberty Loan quota. We'll look unpatriotic. Morale for the war will decrease, and we'll cause public panic. Philadelphia newspaper reporters wrote stories saying that the parade posed a danger to public health, and the Philadelphia publishers refused to run them. The support for the war in Philly and throughout much of the nation was quite remarkable. Anna Milani was a young girl in Philly, and she and her friends sang this song. I'm not going to sing it, I'll just say it. Tramp, 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 the boys are marching. I spy Kaiser at the door. We'll get a lemon pie and we'll squash him in the eye, and there won't be any Kaiser anymore. Well, as the death toll mounted, the rhyme changed. I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened the window and in flew Enza. Philly held its Liberty Loan parade. 200,000 people watched this parade, and guess what happened? The hospitals were filled up within 3 days. There were 31 hospitals in the Philadelphia area, and they were all filled up. And by October the 5th, just 1 week after the parade, 4,500 people in the city had died. The city's almshouse was turned into an emergency hospital. It had 500 beds. They were all filled in 1 day. On October the 3rd, Dr. Kristen finally started shutting things down. He closed the schools and the churches and the theaters, the movie houses, but he did not close the saloons. And one reason is that many of the patrons of the saloons supported the Republican machine led by the Ver brothers. There was a Presbyterian minister who said, what's going on here? You're closing the churches, but you're not closing the saloons. And the state had to intervene and shut down the saloons. There were no funerals allowed in the chapels or funeral homes. The draft was postponed in Philadelphia. The city's transit company disinfected cars. Does that sound familiar? Wherever you go, whatever you do, someone's disinfecting what you touch. Signs went up in Philadelphia, said no spitting. 60 spitters were arrested in 1 day. Even though the death toll continued to mount, the Philadelphia newspapers and Dr. Kristen minimized the threat. Dr. Kristen said there is no cause for alarm. The newspaper said the peak of the epidemic has been reached. John Barry writes this about Philadelphia: soon the daily death toll from influenza alone would exceed the city's average weekly death toll from all cases, all illnesses, all accidents, all criminal acts combined. There were 748 deaths per 100,000 people in Philadelphia, and I think that was second only to Pittsburgh. I think Pittsburgh had more dead flu victims per 100,000 people than any other city. Anna Milani said that right across the street from her, a family buried a 15-year-old girl and then lost a baby to the flu. Some of these flu victims died within 12 to 24 hours after the first symptoms. There, in her neighborhood and throughout much of Philadelphia, people put color-coded crepe on the doors to indicate the age group of the person who had died. And so white crepe symbolized that a young person had died, black crepe, middle-aged, and gray, of course, elderly person. And Anna Milani, who was just a kid, said she and her playmates were excited to find out who had died next until the flu hit Anna Milani's family. She said, we were all sleeping close to one another because we only had 2 beds in the one room. Harry, who was her baby brother, was very sick with the flu. And Anna said that she was like a second mother to Harry. Anna recalled, he died with my name in his mouth. I remember my mother putting a white piece of cloth over his face and they closed the casket. I can't forget it. It was very, very bad. Harriet FERRELL lived in Philly and she was just an infant. Her mother was trying to care for 7 sick people at the same time. Harriet got the flu and the doctor said to Harriet's mother, don't feed her anymore, it won't do any good. She won't live. Fortunately, Harriet survived. Throughout Philly and throughout the United States, there was a shortage of nurses and doctors, shortage of caskets. 1/4 of Philly's doctors were in the military. The J.G. Brill Company in Philly made trolley cars for the city, and it provided the city with wooden boxes that served as caskets. Bodies piled up at the morgue and in homes. Patrol wagons came by. The police and volunteer priests got into the patrol wagons and picked up victims in wooden boxes. I didn't know this, but many, many years ago, pasta used to come in very large boxes. And Louise Apuches of Philadelphia recalled a neighbor boy, about 7 or 8 in Philly, died. And they used to just pick you up, wrap you up in a sheet, and put you in a patrol wagon. So the mother and father came out screaming, let me get a macaroni box. Please, please, let me put him in the macaroni box. Don't take him away like that. There was a shortage of grave diggers. Some of the grave diggers got sick with the flu, and others said, we're not going to bury anybody who had the flu. So seminary students got jobs digging the flu. Prisoners got temporarily released from the jail to dig graves. A steam shovel just buried the dead in a potter's field. Nevertheless, the death toll continued to rise, and newspapers and Dr. Kristen downplayed the epidemic. The Philadelphia Inquirer wrote, live a clean life. Do not even discuss influenza. Worry is useless. Talk of cheerful things instead of the disease. Dr. Kristen said, keep warm, keep out of crowds, keep the bowels open, eat and sleep well, breathe fresh air. Imagine that, a political leader minimizing a pandemic. William SARDO was 6 years old in 1918 in Washington, D.C. His father owned a funeral home. And William SARDO recalled that their living room and dining room were filled with caskets. William SARDO recalled the fearsome part of it was that these were friends of yours that were passing away. These were people that you went to school with or church with. It was very eerie, very, very eerie. John DELANO, who lived in New Haven, Connecticut, was 6 years old, and he and his 2 friends went down the street to the funeral parlor and climbed up and down the caskets that were outside. And his mother said to him, John, don't do that. There are dead people in those boxes. And it wasn't too long before John and his 2 playmates got the flu. Unlike Philadelphia, St. Louis acted quickly and had far fewer deaths, as this graph shows. Within 2 days of the flu hitting Philadelphia, the health commissioner, Max Starkloff, began shutting down the schools and the churches and the playgrounds and the libraries. And no more than 20 people could gather in one setting. Employers staggered work shifts and limited the number of riders on streetcars. Some of the Philadelphia soldiers ended up in Seattle, Washington, and they spread the virus. But state officials in Washington waited almost a month before they began shutting things down, and the restrictions there were hit and miss. Seattle allowed public celebrations on Armistice Day, November the 11th. 1/2 of the 5,000 people who died in the state of Washington were between the ages of 20 and 39. Now think about if you're under a lockdown in 1918, what can you do? What was there to do? There's no radio. I mean, the first commercial radio station is KDKA out of Pittsburgh in 1920. And there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, no computers, no television. So what do? Well, fortunately, Violet Harris of Seattle, who was 15 in 1918, kept a diary. And she, of course, wrote that she was happy when schools closed. And so she baked a dress. She used recipes from a newspaper to make fudge, which was so bad she had to throw at least half of it away. After a while, boredom set in. She couldn't visit her best friend, Rena. And when she finally got to meet Rena again, she asked Rena, "What's the flu like?" And Rena simply replied, "Don't get it." Seattle had closed the schools for 6 weeks, and then they opened on Thursday. And Violet, who had been bored stiff, was now angry that the schools were open. She said, "Thursday, did you ever?" As if they couldn't have waited until Monday. Worse than boredom was the fear that gripped Americans. People were simply afraid to talk to each other, to eat with each other. Daniel Tonkin was a kid in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And he said, you couldn't play with your playmates, your classmates, your neighbors. You had to stay home and just be careful. The fear was so great that people were actually afraid to leave their homes. People were actually afraid to talk to one another. It was almost like, don't breathe in my face. Don't look at me and breathe in my face. You never knew from day to day who was going to be next on the death list. That was the horrible part. People just died so quickly. Her father owned a store in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and 4 of his 8 sales girls died of the flu or of pneumonia. Daniel had an uncle living with him, Benny, and Benny had to go to Fort Bragg to be inducted into the Army. When he got there, he learned that the draft had been postponed. So he came back home, and the family said, "We don't want you. You can't live here anymore. You've been around 6 soldiers." They relented and let him back in, but they were scared to death. William Sardo, see if this sounds familiar. The toll that the flu took on communities. William Sardo wrote, it kept people apart. It took away all your community life. You had no school life, no church life. You had nothing. It completely destroyed all family and community life. People were afraid to kiss one another. People were afraid to eat with one another. They were afraid to have anything that made contact because that's how you got the flu. You were constantly afraid. You were afraid because you saw so much death around you. When each day dawned, you didn't know whether you would be there when the sun set that day. It wiped out entire families from the time the day began in the morning to bedtime at night. When John DeLano, who was 6 in New Haven, Connecticut, got back to go to school, he noticed that some of his playmates weren't there. So after school, he went to their homes and he knocked on the door and he said, where's Roger or Bobby or Susie? And the person who answered the door said, "Let your mother tell you." And Delano recalled, "I was a pretty lonely kid at the time because these were my friends that I played with all those years and went to school with. And when I lost them, why, my whole world changed." Something similar happened to William Maxwell, who was 10 years old in 1918. He would eventually become a writer of fiction and an editor for the New Yorker magazine. He lived in Lincoln, Illinois, a small town, 12,000 people. And at first, he and his family weren't too concerned about the flu, but then it kept moving closer and closer to the Midwest. His mother, who had the great name of Blossom, was pregnant in 1918, and her pregnancy and the threat of the flu led Mom and Dad to send William to live with a paternal aunt. And William hated this aunt's house. He said it was dark and gloomy. The aunt even kept a picture of William's grandfather lying in the coffin. William Maxwell, 10 years old, got the flu, and he was bedridden. And one day the phone rang. And he knew what had happened. His mother, who was pregnant, had died. And he says, my mother was marvelous. And when she died, the shine went out of everything. And he was 10 years old when he realized that nobody is safe from tragedy. Terrible things could happen to anybody. The death rate was so staggering that Dr. Victor Vaughn, who was the dean of the University of Michigan Medical School and then became a commissioned officer in the US Army during World War I, said that if the current rate of death continued, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. And epidemiologist Shirley Fannin said, was it the flu going to kill everybody? Could this be the end of the world? Is this the Armageddon that the street corner ministers are preaching about? Morality broke down. Not surprisingly, people stole caskets. I read that some companies hired guards to guard the casket. In Chicago, a worker showed that he would cure his family of the flu. He slashed the throats of his wife and his kids. In San Francisco, a health department official shot a fellow who refused to wear a mask. The fellow who got shot survived, but then he got arrested for not wearing the mask. This flu pitted county against county. We'll go to Michigan here. Leelanau County and Grand Traverse County bordered each other, and officials in both counties blamed the other county for spreading the flu. And to make a long story short, the quarrel became so quarrelsome that the Michigan State Police had to step in and close the border. The fellow who ran the health department in Grand Traverse County, E.L. Thurby, minimized the pandemic. He undercounted the flu cases, was investigated by the state, and resigned. Very little help came from the federal government. As far as we know, President Wilson made no comment publicly about the flu. And there's no evidence of private comments. His focus, of course, was on the war and then getting the peace treaties written in France. Dr. Rupert Blue was the Surgeon General, and he did very little. The fellow who ran the hygienic laboratory asked Rupert Blue for $10,000 to research pneumonia, and he said no. If there's a knight in shining armor here during this pandemic, it's the Red Cross. The Red Cross provided the nurses and the caregivers to help communities, even communities that were in the boonies. It wasn't as if all the physicians were like Dr. Kristen and Rupert Blue. There were some very capable men and women who tried to find out the nature of this flu and to come up with a vaccine or a serum. William Welch was responsible for the pathology department at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Gorgas was the Army Surgeon General. He had combated yellow fever and malaria. Victor Vaughn, you've met before. Simon Flexer helped organize the Rockefeller University, and at his suggestion, the Rockefeller Institute became part of the Army. So there were some very capable men and women who were trying to come to grips with this flu, but they were behind the eight ball. They had optical microscopes, and the optical microscope couldn't detect a virus. The electron microscope, which could, had not yet been developed. Dr. Alfred Crosby, who wrote the book, The Forgotten Pandemic, says these poor scientists were looking for a needle in a haystack when they didn't know it was a needle they were looking for, and the needle was too small for them to see. No wonder they didn't find it. So with no vaccine, what did you do? Well, you prayed. Evangelist Billy Sunday, who was the most prominent evangelist in the early 20th century, held a revival, and he said, we can meet here tonight and pray down the flu. And as he was preaching, there were people in the audience collapsing from the flu. People tried folk remedies. John DELANO, a little boy in New Haven, Connecticut, put a sack of camphor balls around his neck. Harriet FERRELL said her family put drops of turpentine or kerosene on sugar. Apparently, onions would prevent the flu. Dr. Albert Crosby said that the pandemic called for action, and it's certainly an American characteristic that we have to do something, even if it's wrong. This third wave, the second wave ended in late 1918. The third wave wasn't nearly as deadly, but the third wave may have affected history. John Barry says that President Wilson most likely got the flu while he was in France. Some historians believe that Wilson had been suffering many strokes. We know that he had the big one, the big stroke, after he returned to the United States. But in France, the president had the signs of the flu. He had a very high temperature, a severe cough, and diarrhea. And perhaps his ill health may have contributed to the disastrous Versailles Treaty. Why did the flu run its course? I guess you call it herd immunity. So many people got sick that there weren't enough people left over to carry the pandemic on. What are the lessons to be learned from this pandemic? First and foremost, don't minimize the threat. No politician, no medical figure should minimize the pandemic. The problem comes from not knowing enough. That increases the fear. So you have to be upfront and honest with your people. Number two, public health officials, according to Barry, need the authority in advance to enforce some ruthless decisions. Lockdowns, quarantines, who gets drugs first, who gets the vaccines first. He says neither an epidemic nor an attack will leave time for debate. We need a stockpile of vaccines and other drugs that must be transported quickly. There can be no bottlenecks. And perhaps the last lesson to be learned is the most frightening one. How can we prepare for a disease that we know nothing about, that might wipe out millions of people? That's finally it. Okay.
All right.
Let me. Here. You want me to move this out of your way?
Oh, maybe. Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. I'm down here. Sorry, I'll have to adjust that when I stand. But Kristen is up next. She's going to talk about the plague because we all want it.
Kristen, would you
Are
like
you doing it up here or back there?
I was gonna. Well,
You need that one.
okay, no, it's still doing it. Okay, does it sound normal now? Can you guys hear me? Yes, thank you. I was gonna do it from up there like Tim did, but like I've either need to sit so I know how far I can move my hands, or I need to pace. And it's a smaller space than I envisioned there. So I think I'd keep wandering off the screen. So I'm just gonna do it from back here. Let me load up my PowerPoint. It will only take a second. Wait, no, that's not what I wanted to do. I do this almost every day. You'd think I'd be better at it. Chris, you need to go enable screen sharing on that computer up there. I'll be back. Yes.
Okay.
Success?
Yeah, I think. I thought this would be easier, but it looks like I don't think it's harder, but it's equally complicated. Okay, let me make that little. And there we go. So, Tim, can you see me and hear me?
Yeah,
Okay, and is my screen sharing?
yeah.
Perfect.
I have your PowerPoint on my screen.
Yeah. Okay. So, I chose the topic of the Black Death, the Great Plague of London in 1665 and 6, and COVID-19. Last year, when we watched COVID-19 roll across Asia at us and Europe at us here in our little corner of the United States, it struck me as very familiar. We've been here before. We've seen things like this before. We're all familiar with George Santayana's famous quotation, "Those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it." But I've never found that exactly true. There's a different philosopher who makes a similar statement that appeals to me more, and that's Voltaire, the 18th century philosopher. And he says, history never repeats itself. Man always does. And with this pandemic, I think that's true. History is not repeating itself, or at least when we compare it to the Black Death or the other instances of the bubonic plague throughout history. It's not repeating itself, but how we're responding does. What humanity does repeats itself. And I think you can see that in what I'll tell you about the bubonic plague. I think you can see that in how we're responding to COVID-19 today. And I think you can see that in what Tim just talked about with the Spanish flu in 1918. So my historical specialty is early modern Europe. And so as I was thinking about COVID-19, I thought about the pandemic that I'm most familiar with, the Great Plague of London in 1665 and 6. It was one of the last big instances of the bubonic plague. It first appeared in the 14th century with the Black Death and rolled across Europe periodically about every decade or so for centuries afterwards. Sometimes in lesser outbreaks, sometimes in greater outbreaks. And in the Great Plague of London, it was one of the greater outbreaks. In the city of London, about 100,000 people died. If a plague of that proportion hit London today, 2 million people would die. And that was nothing compared to the first instance of the bubonic plague in medieval Europe. There had been plagues in the ancient world as well. But in medieval Europe, the first instance was the Black Death. In 1347, the bubonic plague appeared in Europe and killed 25 million people by most estimates. Some people say a few, some people say fewer, some people say a lot more. 25 million seems about right to me based on the reading that I've done. If that happened today, 250 million Europeans would die. And if a disease of the proportions of the Black Death hit the world, 2.5 billion people would die. The more I looked at these pandemics, the more I saw similarities to our current situation. Now, before I go any further, let me talk about the differences, because the bubonic plague and COVID-19 are not even remotely the same thing. For one thing, the bubonic plague is much, much, much more deadly. In the pre-modern era, about 60% of the people who contracted the bubonic plague in the usual way, it's a bacterial disease carried by fleas. So usually you get it when enough bacteria are transmitted to you through flea bites. In the pre-modern era, if you got the bubonic plague in the usual way, about 60% of the people who got it that way died. Usually within 3 to 5 days of first showing symptoms. And the symptoms, sorry, I'm famous for forgetting to advance my slides. The symptoms were first, you'd get big boils called buboes around your lymph nodes, usually on the top half of your body, around your neck if you were bitten on the top half of your body, or in your groin if you were bitten on the bottom half of your body. They'd swell, they were painful, and they'd be followed by a high fever, and then increasing trouble in breathing, circulation, bodily functions as the pain and infection spread. And then 60% of the time, the people died. If they lived long enough, and the disease spread to their lungs, it could turn into pneumonic plague, which was airborne and could spread through the air, and that was fatal about 90% of the time, as people who contracted it in its airborne form had difficulty breathing, also got the buboes, and gradually lost control of their bodily functions and their organs until they begged for death. And that wasn't even the worst way to get the plague, because if you got the plague directly into your bloodstream from the blood of an infected person, that was called septicemic plague, which the blessing there is it was usually a lot less painful, and sometimes you didn't even have the buboes, but the worst part of it, the thing that made it worse was that was because you didn't have time. If you contracted septicemic plague, it was fatal almost 100% of the time, and usually within 12 to 14 hours. Before you even knew you had it, you died. COVID-19, not even, even people today, the bubonic plague is still around. We know mostly how to prevent it and how to avoid it. But still, globally, there's a few people who catch it. And even though we have vaccines, even though we have antibiotics, which do work because it's a bacterial disease, it's still fatal about 10% of the time. So COVID-19, not even remotely the same thing. It's a viral disease spread by airborne droplets from infected people. We know how to avoid it. Social distancing and mask use work. People who contract the disease will probably survive. Even the most dire predictions have 98% of the people who contract COVID-19 surviving. It's not the same thing, which doesn't mean that COVID-19 isn't a serious disease. It totally is. It's a viral disease. We don't know the long-term consequences. We don't know about long-term damage to organs, especially your lungs. We don't know if it can recur. We don't know a lot about it. And it's already killed 500,000 people in the United States alone, and about 3 million people, globally. So it's a severe disease, but it's not the Black Death. So that's the difference. What's similar, though, is how we as human beings, especially as human beings in Western civilization, respond to these diseases, respond to any pandemic. When the Black Death first appeared in the 14th century, people looked for the cause. It probably originated in Western China when a group of rodents, probably rats or marmots, were displaced, either from people moving into their habitat and hunting them more, or from a natural disaster. If they were displaced by an earthquake or something and sought new places to burrow, it might have brought them into more contact with humans. Either way, a lot of those rodent hosts probably died out, and the plague bacteria, which infested the fleas, which infested the rodents, was forced to find new hosts. They didn't have enough rats or marmots or whatever they were living on to live on anymore. So they looked for new hosts. They were now in more contact with human beings. Some of them started biting human beings and transmitting the plague to human beings. The fleas didn't really like living on human beings, and so they bit more. They're angry, they're hungry, they're mad, they bite more. Human beings acquire more plague bacteria, and it starts to spread. Sometimes they spread to, they continue to live on rats and spread to other rats, especially the black rat as well. And plague-infested humans and plague-infested rats started carrying the plague around Western Asia, throughout Asia and North Africa, and probably killed about 25 million people before it even hit Europe, and then killed 25 million people more in the first 5 years of the Black Death. We're not sure about any of these figures because people weren't great about keeping birth control, birth certificate records. We're not 100% sure how many people were there, how many people there were, or how many people died. These are just the best estimates that we've been able to come up with. The plague was carried through growing trade networks around Asia, around North Africa, and into Europe. And it hits Europe on the island of Sicily in the city of Messina in 1347. And there it finds perfect conditions. Messina, like most European cities, especially most port cities, had spent the last 100 years or so growing very, very rapidly as Europe finally recovered from the devastation that followed the fall of Rome. The city grew faster than its infrastructure could keep up, including its sanitation systems. They had no way to keep up. People piled trash, refuse in the streets, pushed it off to the side until it could be carted away. Sometimes that took months or even years. There weren't enough places to dump human waste, excrement. And so a lot of the time that ended up in the trash heap too. Slaughterhouses had no good way to dispose of the parts of the animals they were slaughtering that they weren't going to use. So that ended up in the trash heap too. That meant there were rats, there were vermin everywhere in 14th century medieval cities. The fleas had a whole lot of hosts, animal hosts and human hosts, and they started spreading around Messina. Fresh water was hard to come by in this overcrowded city. People didn't wash very much because they had better uses for that water for consuming it and for cooking with it. It was a mess, quite literally. A lot of the buildings were roofed with thatch. There were lots of places for rats and other vermin to hide, and the fleas that they carried with them. The plague started to spread once it appeared in Messina. The fleas spread all over the town, biting people and animals and spreading more and more and more. As the death toll rose, people fled. A lot of the ships that had come carrying the plague were prepared, wanted to leave before they could be quarantined. As people realized what was happening, they tried to quarantine these ships. The ships were like, no, we don't want to be quarantined. So they left as soon as they could, carrying the plague to more ports. Even if they, a lot of other people in Messina fled the city too, going wherever they could. Some of them fled to nearby Catania and hoping to worship at the shrine of Saint Agatha, a patron saint of certain illnesses, mostly associated with childbirth and maternity. But that was the best they could do, looking for a patron saint of illness near Messina. And pretty soon Catania was infected too, and people left for more and more cities looking for someplace that was safe. And it started to spread in waves, and you can kind of see how it progressed on this map. It started to spread in waves all across Europe. Now, some of the things that 14th century European cities did help. City governments urged cleanliness. They hired workers to haul away the trash. They cleaned the streets. They made more places to dump human waste so that it didn't end up in areas that could infect people. Slaughterhouses were prohibited from throwing unwanted pieces of animals wherever they wanted. Public funerals were outlawed, except for the rich. They went from very public, very involved funerals to carrying the bodies away as quickly as possible. In Spain, they started burning the mattresses and clothing of plague victims. Ships were quarantined for 40 days upon arrival, so any plague-infected sailors would be revealed before they entered the city. But some of the things that cities did didn't help. A lot of people thought that they were being punished for immorality, so they banished criminals and especially prostitutes, most of whom just moved on to other cities, and some of whom were already infected with the plague and carried it with them. Visitors from areas of Italy where the plague first appeared, even if they hadn't been there in years, had to pay substantial fines before they could enter certain cities, sometimes the equivalent of thousands of dollars in today's money. While they hauled off the bodies of plague victims immediately, they didn't bury them immediately. In most cities, because they couldn't keep up with the rate at which people were dying, established plague pits. They would stack bodies in pits, cover them with a little bit of soil until it was all the way full, sometimes with thousands of bodies, and then they'd cover it all over with 6 feet or more of dirt. When they quarantined the ships, they still permitted the ships to dock, which allowed desperate sailors to sneak off the ship under the cover of night, and more importantly, the ship's rats to sneak off the ship under the cover of night and bring the plague into the city. In Florence, as half the city died, the government, desperate to find workers, started hiring criminal exiles, allowing them to return to the city as bacchini, grave diggers. And then many of them extorted money from people, demanded extra money to bury the dead, disposed of them wherever they wanted, and robbed and attacked people who refused to pay them. They were known to occasionally say, give us money or we'll murder you and tell everyone you died of the plague. And since we're burying everybody who died of the plague anyway, no one will ever know. Some cities tried their best to avoid the plague or limit its consequences, but others argued that it was an exaggerated danger. One of the leading doctors of the day, Gentile de Foligno from Perugia, Italy, argued that the plague was not that bad. It was exaggerated, but as the plague got closer and closer to Perugia, he got more concerned and started arguing that they should strictly enforce quarantine and plugging his miracle cure-all, theriac, a medieval medicine that had been around for a while, whose primary ingredient was ground up snakeskin. He succumbed to the plague himself in June of 1348. As well as theriac, people swore by a variety of cures. Some of them seem ridiculous today. Somebody said you should take a frog and put it on top of the bubo and it would suck the poison out. And they also suggested doing this with a pigeon and with onions, just like in World War I. Some of the wealthy people were urged to grind up emeralds and consume them, which seems very dangerous. Eating broken glass, basically broken glass, is never a good idea. It was usually ground fine enough that it probably wouldn't have torn up their insides, but also you never know if they're dying of the plague anyway. They were urged to avoid eye contact with the sick, lest evil spirits travel from an infected person to infect you. Some of their ideas were on the right track. A lot of people urged people to follow the ideas of Galen, the ancient world's greatest physician, and told people to bathe, remove the corpses, surround themselves with fresh air as much as possible, which all sounds brilliant and like great ideas. And it's really cool that Nostradamus, the 16th century guy who's famous for predicting the future, was predicting all of that. But before you get too excited, he was one of the biggest supporters of Galenic medicine as a cure for the plague. But before you get too excited, Galenic medicine also gave us the idea that plague and most other diseases came from miasmas, which are bad smells arising from swamps. And Galen was the guy who said that most disease came about because the humors in your blood were unbalanced. And you should rebalance them by bloodletting. On an individual level, people behave similarly. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the most popular and famous book of this time, the Decameron. And in the prologue, he explains how this crowd of people came to all be together, telling each other the stories found in the Decameron. In Florence, when the plague was approaching, he says most people either withdrew from society and avoided people as much as possible, or threw themselves into socializing, attending parties, having fun. Not only acting like nothing was happening, but acting like this was your last chance to enjoy life. And a lot of people chose a middle ground, either unwilling to withdraw from everything that they liked about their lives, or not having the resources to withdraw. Because if you don't have money to live on if you leave your city, you really have no choice but to face the plague. The 10 main characters in the Decameron are all young and rich, and they choose to go off into the countryside alone and spend the time waiting out the plague, amusing themselves by telling each other stories while they wait for the plague to pass. All the while, people are searching for reasons. Some people thought they're being punished for immorality and cast out prostitutes and other people they disapproved of. The flagellants famously traveled from town to town, whipping themselves publicly in an attempt to accept punishment for sins and thereby ward off the plague. A lot of people blamed outsiders, people from other countries, and especially the Jews. Jews were increasingly targeted in riots during this time, either killing them or trying to drive them from their cities. In Sion, Switzerland, the 11 Jews were tortured until they confessed that they had put a plague poison in a local well, even though they also drank from that well and no one knew how the plague was spread. But they were believed to be responsible, and they were tortured until they said that they were, in order for the torture to stop. And as the story of Sion spread, violence against Jews in Europe intensified. To his credit, Pope Clement VI, the Pope at the time, urged people not to attack the Jews, said it's not their fault. But people stopped listening to him after he fled the papal city of Avignon. They spent most of the 14th century in Avignon, France, instead of in Rome. When he fled Avignon to avoid the plague, while half of the city of Avignon died. His personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, is one of the heroes of the Black Death because he stayed behind in Avignon to treat people as best he could and contracted the plague himself, but was one of the 40% of people who survived. Some people blamed astrology or saw a series of recent earthquakes as a portent. Many people followed the best advice of the day, best medical advice of the day, and urged people to avoid miasmas, those bad smells arising from swampy areas, saying that's what causes the plague. Some people said you could overpower miasmas by covering yourself in human excrement, and the bad smell from all of that excrement would overpower any miasmas that you might encounter. A more popular miasma-based idea was that you surround yourself with things that smell good, and the good smells from the herbs that you carried with you would also protect you from any miasma smells. And the famous plague doctor outfit with the beaked mask. It doesn't arise until the 17th century, but usually the beak was filled with good smelling herbs in order to ward off the plague miasmas. In Paris, doctors urged the population to remain calm, saying that people who were upset were much more likely to succumb to the plague. And I always wonder if that's because they don't want to deal with a lot of upset people. It's like, be calm or you're going to die, or if they really believed that. As more people died, the communities of Europe adapted and found ways to keep functioning. One of the last countries that was hit by the first wave of the plague, the Black Death, was England. And they were one of the most prepared to keep the business of life going. As half of England died and England was unable to find enough priests to give communion and last rites, the Bishop of Bath and Wells gave deacons the right to give communion. John Ronwick, a farm manager in the village of Farnham, paid higher wages, encouraged his employees to work extra to make up for the lost efforts of their dead colleagues, used the taxes his lord collected from people who had inherited land and farm animals in order to pay for it all, and got the harvest in on time in 1348. London built plague pits, but as one of the last places to be hit by the Black Death, their pits are better organized. The bodies are all faced the same way. They're sorted by age and gender, and there's a thicker layer of dirt in between the layers of bodies. The Black Death appeared to die out in 1352, 5 years after it had appeared, and the people of Europe rejoiced, throwing themselves into luxury, social activities, and leisure until it reappeared in Russia in 1362. It rolled across Europe again, but was less deadly and missed many places. When it surfaced again in 1369, the same thing happened. Perhaps sanitary measures helped to slow the plague spread. Perhaps the plague-carrying fleas and their rodent hosts had found a new symbiosis, so it was less likely to spread to humans. Perhaps humans started to build up a resistance to the plague and could tolerate and eliminate more bacteria before the deadly symptoms appeared. Whatever the reason, and it's probably a combination of all of those and more. The plague remained a deadly disease and recurred in waves for centuries, but was never as severe as it was its first time around. Every time, Europeans learned more about what to do and what not to do when plague happened. And by the time of the Great Plague of London, Londoners felt as well prepared as they could possibly be for the plague. Most Londoners who could afford it followed the adage, go early, stay far away, return late. King Charles II and his family fled to the countryside, followed by most of the wealthiest families in England. Shops worried about bankruptcy as their best customers fled the city and demanded to be paid in full before goods changed hand or services were rendered. While no one was sure exactly what caused the plague, animals were believed to be carriers, and the London city government hired animal control people to kill 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats in the city. Elizabeth Pepys, wife of a powerful government official, Samuel Pepys, was terrified that her pet dog would be swept up in the slaughter and refused to let him out of her sight. Ironically, the dogs and cats were probably not the carriers, and killing them all probably did a lot of harm. A lot of people complained about the overpowering presence of rats in the next few months of the plague, once all of their natural predators had been killed. And rats were much more likely to carry the fleas that spread the plague. People who contracted the plague were suspected to have contracted the plague were identified by old women who were hired as searchers, plague searchers, women who had had some experience with the plague and were paid to diagnose cases. If a searcher diagnosed you as a victim, you would be quarantined in your home with all the fellow occupants for 40 days. If they could afford it, quarantined people could send out for food that would be delivered as contactless as possible. But if they were poor, the city gave them each the equivalent of about $50 in today's money to feed themselves during their entire quarantine. That $300 stimulus check is looking pretty good right now, isn't it? In comparison. Guards were posted outside the doors of the quarantine houses, but conditions in the plague houses were bad, and people had to be forced to stay in there, thus the guards. The city hired physicians, apothecaries, and surgeons to try to treat the plague victims, and most of them had seen the plague coming. Londoners knew that the plague was headed their way. None of the cities near London were hit as heavily as London was. But they knew it was coming. They'd read up, they had the best medical information available to them at the time. but there were not enough of them. Doctors were rarely among the richest members of society, but when all the rich people fled, a lot of them took their doctors with them in case they got the plague anyway. So a lot of the wealthiest doctors left. And some doctors did have the financial means to leave the city on their own. Some stayed behind out of altruism. Some stayed behind in response to the increasing fees the city offered to physicians who would treat plague patients. But there was at best one medical professional for every several thousand plague patients. Most people stricken with the plague were left on their own, and often their friends and family were so afraid of contracting it or of being quarantined that they abandoned their stricken relatives. We'll never know how many more people might have survived the plague if they had more care. We also know that along with the Great Plague, there were outbreaks of other diseases, such as smallpox and spotted fever. And sometimes those were misdiagnosed as plague, and sometimes plague was misdiagnosed as them, smallpox in particular. And just like commentators today argue about whether COVID or influenza is more to blame for the high death rate of the past year, people at the time and historians still wonder how many smallpox victims were diagnosed with the plague and vice versa. The city continued to function, and just like today, it was the essential workers who made it happen. Most of the upper class and many of the middle class who could afford to flee did. Daniel Defoe, who lived through the Great Plague as a child and collected or invented stories about it decades later, believed that those with resources had to choose between protecting themselves and protecting their goods. Gervais Jacques, one of the top servants of the powerful Huntingdon family, kept a journal when he was left behind to look after the family's London properties when they fled to their country estate. Samuel Pepys, husband of Elizabeth, a powerful government official famous for his meticulously kept diary, stayed behind to attend to his bureaucratic duties with the Royal Navy while he sent his wife and his mother and his in-laws away for their safety. Most in the middle class, though, and almost all of the poor were forced to stay. Public gatherings were outlawed, schools and courts were closed, taverns and inns were shuttered. Church services were the only permissible public gatherings, and even those were more likely attended and in danger of being shut down. And yeah, they did the opposite. They closed the taverns before they closed the churches. Servants and skilled workers were the most susceptible people to the plague because they were the most likely to go out and have contact with lots of people and go into areas where they were more likely to get bitten by the fleas that were everywhere in London. Most of the people who could afford to have somebody go out into the plague-stricken city did so. Sometimes that wasn't possible. As people are dying in larger and larger numbers, it's harder to find people who are willing to run your errands for you and take on that danger for themselves. But people who could afford it kept raising wages, and people who were skeptical of their own safety kept taking the higher wages. In the countryside, the harvest of 1665 came in on time, plentifully, but most farmers were reluctant to travel into the city to sell their goods. Instead, they sold them at the city boundaries to carters and investors who took them to the usual markets and sold them for a profit. Samuel Pepys saw this opportunity, hired a bunch of carters to help him, and quadrupled his wealth during this time. As cash was taken by the upper and middle class people fleeing the city or hidden within their vacant homes, merchants switched to dealing with letters of credit and bills of exchange and temporarily became a cashless society until things returned to normal. The church continued to function, providing for people's religious needs. And as the plague died down in early 1666, those who had fled returned, and London went back to its usual ways, little changed from before the Great Plague. The experience of people during the Black Death and the Great Plague is much deadlier than ours, but it seems familiar. We're looking for answers about COVID the same way they were desperately looking for answers about the plague. Some of us turn to the accepted science of our day, just like some of the people then did. Others look for other reasons, and look for people to blame. Some of us are extremely cautious about the pandemic. Others of us insist that measures like that are overblown and continue trying to live our lives as close to normal as we can. Some of us follow the recommendations for prevention that experts recommend. Others of us grasp at proposed cures and try things that have not been scientifically proven. People did all these things during the Black Death too, and people did all these things during the Great Plague too. Hundreds of years later, we know that some of what they did was right and some of what they did was dead wrong. But everything they did made sense to them at the time. Just like I think all of our responses to COVID-19 make sense to us. So I ask you, is Voltaire right? Even though history is not repeating itself, are we?
Can't see me. I'm at the front, but I covered the camera. Well, I'm going to talk about yellow fever, mankind's deadliest enemy in the animal kingdom. Well, maybe other than other people.
Oh, hold on.
Hold on. Oh, they're still looking at your screen, huh? Not me?
You're still muted.
Yeah.
No, I don't know why. Great, wonderful. Okay, it seems to be working. Anyway, yes, yellow fever, mankind's deadliest enemy in the animal kingdom. Other than, well, maybe other people, the mosquito. Problem is, people in 1793, Philadelphia, when they got an outbreak of yellow fever, had no idea what causes it. We know now, and people didn't figure this out till about 1900, that mosquitoes carry yellow fever, and if they bite you, they can give it to you. In Philadelphia in 1793, no one quite knew how yellow fever reached the city. And in fact, how you thought it got there quickly got caught up in controversy. A city of 50,000 people, the largest in the United States of America, also the capital of the country. When yellow fever broke out late in August 1793, 15 or 20,000 people fled. Oh, they had somewhere else to go. Congress wasn't in session because Congress didn't usually meet in August because August was a hot, humid, sweaty month in Philadelphia, and they didn't have air conditioning. So if you want to abuse Congress, please abuse them for something other than this. They weren't there, but an awful lot of the government left. George Washington left town in early September, but to be fair to our founding father, he was scheduled to go on vacation in September. He went, in fact, to what would become the city named for him to lay the cornerstone of the United States Capitol that September, which was a pre-arranged event. He just didn't come back. By the time he made it back to Pennsylvania, he decided it would be quite prudent for him not to risk his life in the city, but to hang out outside of town, out in Germantown for a while until he was absolutely sure it was safe. While there, he realized, this might not end. Congress is supposed to come to town in November. Should I tell them not to? He asked his advisors. And Thomas Jefferson said, sorry, Congress is the legislative branch, and you, sir, Mr. President, can't tell them what to do. Hamilton said, whoa, don't tell them what to do. Recommend it. Yes, tell them if this isn't over by November, you recommend they pick a different place other than Philadelphia to meet. As it turned out, nobody cared because by November it was over. Of the 35, well, maybe even 30,000 who stayed in the city, 17,000 people got sick with yellow fever. Fortunately, only about 5,000 of them died. So in 2 months, 10% of the city. That sounds kind of serious. There was a theory going around that summer and fall that if you were African American, and 6% or so of Philadelphia was, Pennsylvania had ended slavery rather recently, but it had a sizable, for a non-Southern city, African American population, that you wouldn't get yellow fever, that this was associated with the tropics and you wouldn't have it. Well, that's right, but it's wrong. It's right in the sense that if you get yellow fever and survive it, you're done. You can't get it again. But the problem is most African Americans in Philadelphia were born in North America, far from yellow fever, and had never had it. So they're going to get sick and they're going to die about the same rate as white Philadelphians did. How do they cope with this? Well, this is going to sound familiar. They ran away, if they could. Of those who can't run away because they have nowhere to go or no money to run with, most of them stayed home and didn't go out. They honestly had no idea how this was spread. They had no idea it was from mosquitoes. Philadelphia was a very compact city in 1793. It didn't extend too terribly far inland from the Delaware River. And it didn't take very long for the mosquitoes to spread through the city and spread the infection. So most people's response to that is, if I stay home and don't go out, I won't get sick. Yeah, that didn't necessarily work very well, but it was probably better than nothing. Something that should seem familiar to us. Oh boy, did this get politicized. 1793 was an era of great partisan warfare. By 1793, Federalists and Republicans, two competing, well, for lack of a better term, I'll call them political parties, although they're not necessarily as organized as the modern version we've got now, have sprung up, and they're not in agreement on just about anything. And the lightning rod, and this might sound familiar because over the last year or so, we've had a guy who makes people feel very strongly, either they love him or they hate him. The lightning rod of 1793 wasn't an ex-New York, well, actually he was an ex-New Yorker, I suppose, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton got yellow fever that fall. He became ill and he took what was known as the mild cure. Physicians debated amongst themselves how heroic you had to be to save a patient with yellow fever. And Hamilton decided he liked the mild cure. The more vigorous cure, which Benjamin Rush and other physicians advocated, involved lots of purging, basically powerful laxatives, usually containing mercury, because that's really good for you. And as well, Rush liked to, just as Galen would have said, draw your blood. You had a fever, you were running hot, you should be bled. Hamilton didn't want to go for that. He went for a milder cure, which certainly was a whole lot less hostile to his body. It might not have helped. And when he survived the experience, his political enemies decided he had faked it. Well, that sounds familiar. Getting a disease, a powerful lightning rod political figure who divides the country. And when he gets better, his political enemies say, he never really had it, he faked it, right? Oh, it's all exaggerated. He wants to be the hero of this story. He can't separate himself from this. It was easy for Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and other leading Republicans to rag on Hamilton because they were that September and October nowhere near Philadelphia, so they could criticize him all they wanted. After Hamilton got better, using the more mild cure, local folks started calling this the Federalist cure, and now all of a sudden it's political. What course of action you want to take if you get yellow fever that fall, depended upon which political party you preferred. Oh, that sounds a little familiar. They can't even agree on where this came from. Not that they know it has anything to do with mosquitoes. If they guessed that, they would have been right, but nobody said this. Federalists tended to blame this on a disease that originated outside Philadelphia. It got there somehow. the most popular explanation for this problem was down by the wharves, there was a big pile of spoiled coffee. I'll take a moment of silence to mourn the loss of a lot of coffee, but bad coffee coming into the city just got dumped on the ground and was sitting there, and the outside the city origin blamed it for bringing in bad smell. Oh, it's miasma, right? That'll kill you. And bad air from the coffee was killing Philadelphians. But since coffee is not native to Philadelphia, it obviously got there from somewhere else. Republicans tended to coalesce around the "it's something we're doing wrong" theory, that this city needs a good cleaning. So city health authorities got people out there, they started to clean the streets, which is always better than not cleaning the streets, but didn't have a whole heck of a lot to do with yellow fever, sadly enough. But even where this came from was a source of great political contention. Most people took the side they politically agreed with, whether it fit the facts or not. Now, of course, we know that yellow fever did arrive in Philadelphia from elsewhere. It's not native to Philadelphia. And we're pretty sure, looking back at this, that what had caused this is Philadelphia had gotten a lot more people in the last few months from Haiti. Haiti was having a revolution in the 1790s, a pretty ugly one, I might add, but quite a few people had fled to Philadelphia, the largest city in the United States. And Philadelphians, generally being good-hearted philanthropic people, right? That's Ben Franklin's legacy, if nothing else, took them in, and probably that's where the mosquitoes and the bacteria came from, as best we can tell. Of course, now that this is all politicized, which doctors you listen to depend upon what you think. Oh, it sounds like now, right? Should we be wearing masks? Should we be opening schools? Should we be doing X? Should we be doing Y? Should we definitely not be doing X and Y? All of that gets caught up in partisan politics. And better yet, when the cold weather comes and it kills mosquitoes, and mosquitoes can't breed below a certain temperature, and yellow fever dies down and everybody goes back to normal. And this is the stage we're entering right now, by the way, in the present day. It's time for the dueling books. Yep, first off the scene is Matthew Carey, writes a book about this, comes out later in 1793 because he's in a hurry. You got to be first on the bookshelves to be a bestseller. And he'll write a history of the play, the yellow fever, I should say, in Philadelphia, and he'll blame Benjamin Rush and the Republican doctors. Oh, they didn't know what they were doing. They had no idea. They were killing people by bleeding them to death, or heroic measures didn't work. All of their theories were wrong, and worse yet, not only did they produce lack of success with 5,000 dead, they overcharged the heck out of people to not cure them. Then we get another book. In fact, the first book copyrighted by African-American authors in the history of the United States, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, two residents of Philadelphia, would write a book claiming that Philadelphia's Black community had indeed stood up for the city and done what they were supposed to do. Carey had criticized not just Benjamin Rush, but Philadelphia's African-American residents for profiting off this disease, taking advantage of sick people. So these guys rushed out a response to say, basically, Carey was, at least as far as Philadelphia's Black community was concerned, Carey was full of crap, and you shouldn't listen to him. He had absolutely no credibility. That at great personal risk to themselves, they and other people in their church communities had tended to the sick and helpless in Philadelphia, dug graves, done all the dirty work, and yeah, occasionally got paid, as you might guess, above market rates, because 1/3 of the population had fled, but certainly weren't profiting off misery. And since Black Philadelphians had died at pretty much the same rate, as far as they could tell, with white Philadelphians It wasn't like they didn't share in the city's misery. By the next year, Benjamin Rush came out with his version. Hey, I'm a medical expert, and everything you've heard about this is wrong. Oh, we're what, like the first book or two into the stage of the doing books about ours. But yeah, just like today, disease breaks out. There's an argument over where it came from, how you can get it, although I would say, unlike today, everybody then was wrong. It quickly gets caught up into politics. The most polarizing figure in the country at the time, politically speaking, gets the disease. Everything gets caught up in that. The cure he recommends all of a sudden is a political cure. Yeah, it sounds like we never left the 21st century, doesn't it? Anyway, it's a little afterward, and I said this could end at was going to end at 11:30, but I lied. I got to start class at noon, but I'm willing to go to at least 11:45, probably even at 10 to 12. Yeah, I don't need to worry about those guys. It's just the 1970s, right? When you talk about depressing thing, I can fail at talking about failure. So I wanted to throw it open to you folks in the audience. And here's where I have the problem. As you can see, and yeah, don't get seasick here. Yeah, they're out there. And that's where I've been sitting. Yeah.
Tim
What?
and I both have our.
Oh, you have yours on?
So,
Oh, you're going to be out there and I get to be up here? Oh, okay. I didn't know I had a camera. Anyway, if you'd like to type into the chat box, I got the chat box up there. If you just like to sing out because your microphone works and ask us anything you'd like, we'll do our best to answer it.
Chris, I had a couple of
to ask us anything. This will be a short cruise.
I had a couple of questions, Chris.
I can't hear.
Somebody talking? Oh,
Yeah, Deb. I think Deb is.
Hang on, that's me. That's my fault. When hers was reacting, I shut off the speakers. Try that again. Talking to me. Try that again. We can now hear you, I bet.
There's a big echo.
No.
Can you hear me now?
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
My first question is based on, I mean, just listening to what Tim had to share. I was curious, being a Youper, how might I go about looking to see what happened in 1918 and around that area in a particular location, like the Upper Peninsula? I mean, what would be a good place for me to do any searching for information about that?
You mean a
I think you need
that
to
better?
maybe, no, Chris, yes.
Well, Deb, I have a long list of sources, reading material that I can send you. I did a lot of research on the pandemic. I'm not aware of any particular place, let's say in Grand Traverse County or DELANO, that has material, but I might be mistaken. And I know that's not a good answer. But there's a lot of written material, published material on the pandemic. And I have those sources on my regular computer at home.
Okay.
I would volunteer. Old newspapers are also pretty good because they like to cover local events. So if things have a local impact, you generally get them. Unless I think you get a newspaper run by a guy who kind of wanted to deny all this existed, you're going to get a lot of the day-to-day. But newspapers also love to carry death notices. So if you're looking at them and see a lot of people dying, that's another way. But the newspapers at the time will definitely tell you in a given area what's going on there relative to this. And you can tell whether the editor is playing it up or down if you read enough issues of it, whether they think this is panic worthy or they're in the denial camp.
I think the name of the Grand Traverse paper was the Eagle or the Record Eagle. I don't know that it still exists, but that was the name of the paper in Traverse City.
Yeah,
It does still exist.
Too, and if you go to the different, they have a public library. Most public libraries that their individual local paper bag for as long as they possibly can. And I have local trivia about the Spanish flu. John Beers, was a local doctor who died in the Spanish flu treating patients.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
that's my local Spanish flu trivia.
Huh.
That's all I got. So.
And then Kristen, you said something about there's
Okay. I got a comment here from that nature hasn't changed much, has it? So as each time was politicized. Well, I'd say to that, and I don't know my colleagues would agree that, human nature hasn't changed very much, and man is a political animal, whether we should be or not. Most primates seem to be.
Yeah, and if you're not a political animal, you will become one in a crisis.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah.
Okay, I think that was starting to ask a question.
Okay.
You had said something about the bubonic plague still happening today. I've never heard of it in the United States. Is there a location where it's popular? And what you're gonna have to do, you're gonna have to unmute, and Chris and Tim are gonna have to mute because it's just echoing all over each other.
Oh.
Now you unmute, Chris. Kristen, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought I'd already unmuted, but I think I muted again when it started echoing. It is endemic in parts of the United States, mostly in the southwestern United States and but less so in the Dakotas because it's a little colder there. Prairie dogs are the big carriers in the United States. But most people don't go and spend large amounts of time in prairie dog colonies. There's about anywhere from a dozen to a couple of dozen people who contract it every year. Most people who do go and spend enough time near prairie dog colonies to know that they have a chance of contracting bubonic plague know the symptoms, and as soon as they get a large bump in their armpit on their lymph node, they're loading up with antibiotics as soon as they can. In parts of Africa, it still spreads, but again, it's a very obvious disease. And while it's still deadly in more than 10% of cases, most of those are the people who don't get treatment right away. It's bacteria, so strong antibiotics can usually knock it out before it knocks you out.
Okay, thank you.
I read about 2 months ago that there were some squirrels in Colorado carrying the plague. But I didn't hear any more about it.
Yeah, it can carry it. Wait,
Okay. Yeah, squirrels, basically anything that can carry a flea can carry it. But most fleas have preferred hosts. And so if, most of the fleas that carry it in the US prefer prairie dogs, but there's no reason that they can't live on a squirrel. And occasionally you see squirrels that or other rodents that have it too.
I hunt squirrels. I'm a squirrel hunter, so.
Yeah. Well, it needs enough infested squirrels to do it. I wouldn't worry about squirrels here, although squirrels carry all kinds of stuff. But I wouldn't worry about bubonic plague around here because we don't have enough of the bacteria or enough of the hosts or enough of the right kind of fleas. We need a huge influx of. We need the squirrel invasion from a different part of the country.
Takes care of the squirrel.
Yeah.
Any other? you probably already terminated the connection. What's our next topic? Oh no, what's our next topic? I haven't cleared this with everybody in the room, but I'm thinking about elections and voting and reform and such for 22. So yeah, I haven't cleared that with everybody in the room, but that's my thought. Yes. Oh, see, Tim is also hearing that answer for the first time. So yeah. Yeah, so that's what I'm thinking. Don't know, I can't promise that, but yes.
I call the Great Reform Bill of 1836.
Where can you get a recording? Zoom is automatically recording this, and it should work under the same link you were using, because it stays in the cloud for 90 days when I automatically record it. So it should be there for 90 days. I don't know how to keep it around longer, which is when my students who haven't started the class and should have been starting it in January are about to realize 90 days is not a semester. But when I terminate this, it should pop up as a recording. And this afternoon, any passcodes that get put on it, I will disable that protection. So anybody blundering across them should be able to get the recording. And this works pretty well with my classes. So it's probably going to work pretty well with you. I can't believe all of us are as clueless as all of my students tend to be on such matters. Some of us, I'm sure, are worse. But anything else? Everybody's thinking it's lunchtime and I'm hungry. Yeah, okay. Well, thank everybody who attended, whether you're attending live or you've attended recording. And if you're watching it on replay, if there's anything you want to know about this kind of stuff, you can look up Kristen Robinson, Tim Moore, or myself, Chris Paine, right there on the LMC website directory. You want to drop us email. We're historians. We like to talk about these things, probably far more than you do. So we welcome that kind of stuff. If you're not watching this live and didn't have the opportunity to question us as it is, but I suspect this was enough of a success that we can do this again next spring, except we can do it in a real room and have real audience instead of staring at, well, actually this room is far more crowded than I'm used to, but staring at a computer screen, and maybe it'll go more smoothly this time. So thank you for coming. And well, there'll be a second annual one, I think. This seems to have worked.